Joining me now from New York is Ivana Bilic. She is a Ukrainian activist and attorney. For a Russian perspective, joining us from London is Alexander Nekrasov. He is a former advisor to the Kremlin. Here with me in the studio is Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaffer. He is a senior fellow with the London Center for Policy Research. And joining us from Toronto is Eric Margolis. He is an internationally syndicated columnist and has reported on several wars. Welcome to all of you to the show. Let's start with Ivana in New York. Ivana, President Petro Poroshenko of Ukraine now talking of, quote, a full-scale invasion by Russia. This, in fact, is the first time the president has used words like a full-scale invasion. What does he mean by that? What kind of significance should we attach to it?
Correct. This is the first time he used those words, although the fear of the full-scale invasion always existed, and many people on the ground want this to be called the war, which is the proper term. It's Russian invasion and Russian aggression by all the international legal standards we know, and we have implemented after the World War II. Basically, Russia has occupied and annexed Crimea. Russian forces are in Eastern Ukraine. We have special monitoring mission reporting about the constant violations, and Russia sending 44 tanks, 20 tanks on June 3rd, heavy artillery, rockets, launchers, armed vehicles to Ukraine. This is state-sponsored terrorism.
Alexander, what do you make of this latest turn of events? We've got an escalation in the fighting and, of course, now the president using terms like a full-scale invasion. What are we to make of it?
Well, first of all, I think we should all remember that the fighting started days before the G7 summit opened in Germany. Now, ask yourself this question. Who benefited from that fighting? Obviously, the Kiev regime. And obviously, nobody else would benefit before the G7 summit, which was supposed to discuss extension of sanctions. So that is crystal clear. Now, what Ivana was giving us, those figures about tanks and planes and soldiers, this all comes from the Kiev military. So
it doesn't come from the Kiev military. It comes from the special monitoring system on the special monitoring commission on the ground. It comes from the OCE. It doesn't come from Kiev government.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, Alexander, go on.
No, I'm sorry, but the observers on the ground, European observers, have never confirmed that. So I don't understand where we get all those figures. Now, when
I'm looking at the report right now. I'm looking at the report right now.
When Petro Poroshenko says about the full-scale invasion, unfortunately, I can only say that he's bluffing, because no one in his right mind in Russia would contemplate a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This is madness. And I don't even understand where he gets this from and who is telling him that.
Okay.
Now, as regards the so-called buildup of Russian forces, again, nobody can prove anything. And again, we are talking about people simply making up facts.
Okay. Tony, let me bring you into this. Reuters news agency reporting that the ceasefire has held mostly for the last 4 months, but now we have this 12-hour firefight using, both sides used artillery in this firefight. Right. What do we know about the situation there?
Well, I think it's chaos. With that said, I think both sides have some level to gain. I disagree that one side or the other gains advantage by acting badly. Frankly, both sides are at a time now where I think both sides have their own reasons for drawing attention to it. And I think this triangulation that they're talking about with the Russians are clearly invading. They're just not doing it like a blitzkrieg invasion. This is slow motion. I would compare it to boiling a frog. You put a frog in cold water and you turn the heat up. I agree, the Russians cannot do a full-blown invasion. I and other experts talked about this for the last couple of years, the fact that there would be no full-blown invasion. With that said, there would be a low-level insurgency which has been executed very well by the Russians. I think there's ample evidence that the Russians are using regular forces, trying to hide them as best they can as rebels. And I think that's what the issue is.
The Russian response to that is, yes, there may be Russians fighting on the side of the separatists in this conflict, but they are not from the Russian, they're not Russian regulars, and they are not fighting under the Russian flag.
Reminds me of saying someone works at Kmart, but because they work at Kmart, they really don't work there because they actually stand in the parking lot. It's totally insane. The Russians would be pulling these people out. It's if they don't have any control. You know, you can't have it both ways. You can't have it, oh, they're the Russians, but they're not our Russians. Well, whose Russians are they then? This shows that you have no control over your military forces, which tells me everything I needed to know as a military professional. They're there because the Russians wanted to be there. If they didn't want them to be there, they wouldn't be there.
Eric, the G7 nations, of course, have met in Germany. More sanctions against Russia. That was very high up on the agenda. I mean, up to now, sanctions have not worked. So why talk about more sanctions?
Well, because the White House doesn't really know what else to do. It's under tremendous pressure from Congress to, as they say, get tough, though nobody really wants to say what this means. And, you know, Ukraine, as an impartial observer, I see the Ukrainians as being unnecessarily intransigent. They should be being pushed to make a real political settlement here by granting autonomy to the eastern regions and burying the hatchet with the Russians. After all, Ukraine has got to live next to Russia from now on. But the Ukrainians, and particularly the Ukrainians on the far right, are being encouraged by United States aid, by European backing, by U.S. arms and advisors and Canadian troops coming in. It's a very dangerous situation because we are stumbling, in my view, I've covered 14 wars, stumbling into a war that can either by an accident or by necessity. But one thing I know is that Russia is not invading Ukraine in the classical sense. We're not hearing a word of truth coming out on this subject from anyone. Yes, there are Russian special forces, but an invasion is out of the question. And what's more, the really dark secret here is that neither Russia nor NATO have enough troops and equipment and things to mount a full-scale war.
Ivana, President Putin's position is that the government in Kiev should do more to implement the Minsk agreement. And part of that agreement, of course, calls for more autonomy for the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. So, in effect, does that mean that the onus is now on President Poroshenko to do more?
Well, we should look actually into the history and examine the history. In Ukraine, you didn't have separatist movement until Russia started meddling with Ukrainian affairs. In 1991, 91% of Ukrainians voted for Ukraine to be independent and remain in the same borders. Russia signed numerous agreements and recognized Ukrainian borders. There were no human rights violations coming from Ukraine about Russian speaking or anyone being oppressed or anything of that nature. You have someone taking advantage of porous borders and having covert operations on the ground and taking advantage that they in Crimea, that they had military presence in Crimea, taking over, having a fraudulent referendum under duress, under the guns, and annexing part of the country. The same you're witnessing, very similar situation you're witnessing in the eastern part of Ukraine. The rebels first wanted to join Russia. Now they're changing the story. The story was never straight. Basically, you're dealing with the bandits and very scared people. The civilians are extremely scared. They just want this mess to end. The region never voiced for the autonomy. The Ukrainian sovereignty and integrity, sovereignty and territorial integrity has been jeopardized. The international law and system we built after the World War II, Russia has completely dismantled. And Ukraine, from the legal standpoint of view, they have to defend their country, they have to defend their citizens, they have to defend the territorial integrity. And I would like to address the right-wing argument the gentleman made. In Ukraine, the right wing has less than 2% support. This is unofficial data. It's, as far as we know, Putin supports right wing in France, Hungary, Austria. That's where Marine Le Pen allegedly getting her money from.
Right, let me go to Alexander. Alexander, Russia's consistent position has been that it has no forces in this fight, no skin in this game. But does President Putin, Russia, have any kind of influence or leverage over the rebels?
Well, obviously they have some leverage, and they have been showing that. But I think that what we are talking about here, after I've heard this sort of description of the situation, we all completely ignore the fact that nothing would have happened in Crimea, no referendum, and nothing would have happened in Eastern Ukraine if there was not a violent armed coup in Kiev. And this is the most important bit. We always have to start dancing from the right place. And if that coup didn't happen, we would not have a situation like we have now. So to say that Russia was, trying to cause instability and was interfering in Ukraine, unfortunately, it's not the case. It was the West, Americans, and the European politicians who were calling on the protesters in Kiev to overthrow the government, which was, by the way, an outrageous thing to do in any civilized continent like
knows
Europe.
very well that people at Maidan stood for 3 months demanding the rule of law, justice, and they wanted to be part of Europe because
Ivana,
they
but
share the
when
same
protesters,
values. There was no coup.
When protesters start shooting at police, when protesters start shooting at police, they become combatants.
By the orders of the former President Yanukovych, correct?
This
and
was
the
a
orders
coup.
he got from Moscow.
All right, let me.
Oh no, please!
Let me bring Tony into this.
Work like that.
Tony, there's been sanctions that have been imposed against Russia. Right. More talk of sanctions right now. Now that's worked. Is the West running out of options here?
Well, they are. I mean, going to talk to the point of the coup d'etat and all this other stuff, look, the United States has encouraged a lot of the activities. There's no doubt about that. I was meeting with senior Pentagon officials recently, last week, and there is a perception that maybe we were too aggressive in setting up pro-NATO organizations all around Russia, and I think the Russian response now we're seeing is coming in and pushing back a little bit. So I think our side understands this. With that said, the overarching issue of aggression is something that the U.S. Congress is pushing hard to say we need to do something about. That's why we've stepped up our number of exercises in the Balkans. We've been doing a lot, deploying troops, doing different things. So I think there's been a lot of what I would say muscle flexing on our side with NATO saying, this far, no further.
But there's no military solution.
Well, there's no military solution here, absolutely. But I think clearly the issue economically is how much can Europe afford to not have the relationship with Russia, Gazprom, and other things they're very dependent on. So at this point, I don't think there's any easy answer. I think the solution is clearly diplomatic. But Russia has been doing things to actually destabilize the market for alternates to fuel as well. They do really want to have the market for fuel to Europe. So that's something I think we, United States, could do is basically build the XL pipeline and make all the fuel available that we have. We can be a net exporter of fuel. I think we should consider it as one of our options, non-military.
All right, let me get Eric's view on this. Eric, the United States and Europe talking about sanctions, but they don't seem to be on the same page if one looks at what they're doing here. Europe's response to the call for more sanctions appears to be a little bit lukewarm, not so keen on the idea as the United States. I mean, we have Greece, a member of the European Union, which is actually looking to Russia for help, for financial help. So there's no unity in Europe, is there?
Well, Europe went through World War II. It's got a better memory than most North Americans do about this. And Europe is deathly afraid, as it should be, of a war. However inadvertently it begins, it watches very aggressive steps by the United States now, sending warships into the Black Sea, flying off the coasts of Romania and Bulgaria, and encouraging Ukrainians to be more militant. It is the wrong policy. The Americans have, and I speak as an American, that the Americans look like they're trying to recreate the Cold War. There is a feeling for this in the Pentagon, but it's taken us 40, 50 years to get Russia calmed down and to be a friendly, productive neighbor. And I'd send tourists instead of tanks. And now we're ruining all of this by waking the worst fears in Russia of encirclements instead of cooperation. It is wrong, and it's dangerous. And Europe is not in favor of it. Europe is being arm-twisted in many cases, not all. The Poles, for example, are very militant. But other more cautious Europeans are afraid that they're going to stumble into a conflict that nobody wants, but that nobody can stop. Shades of August 1914.
We are going to take a short break right now. More on Ukraine and Russia when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.